In March 2021, Pakistan started its COVID-19 vaccination drive, and since then, our vaccination rate has steadily climbed up. When we look at it on its own, it seems that we're doing well. But when we start to compare it to other countries like India or Bangladesh, then success starts to look different. And if we compare it to advanced nations like the US, the EU, and the UK, things start to look a lot bleaker. But Pakistan is not alone in its vaccination rate. Most developing countries are lagging behind. But vaccines really are the only thing that can protect us from COVID-19, which means not being vaccinated can have dire consequences for a country.
Nepal has been hit hard by a second wave of COVID-19.
Distressing scenes in hospitals in India, overwhelmed by a record surge in coronavirus cases.
Brazil has recorded more than 4,000 coronavirus deaths in 24 hours.
Still, while most of the world is at risk of devastating outbreaks, in countries with high vaccination rates, life is returning to normal now. But health experts repeatedly warn that the pandemic existing anywhere can be a risk to everyone, everywhere. So why are some countries racing ahead while others are left stranded? Soch explains, vaccine nationalism. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the early days of the pandemic. In March 2020, the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
At that time, rich countries started making deals. Those deals were signed directly with pharmaceutical companies, promising billions of dollars in exchange for early access to vaccines once they passed through safety and efficacy trials. This is what we call a bilateral deal. Basically, before a vaccine is approved for use, it has to go through multiple trials. And while the vaccines were still in these initial development stages, countries chose to make multiple high-risk investments with vaccine manufacturers before they knew if the vaccine would be viable to use or not. In exchange, they got priority access to vaccines once they were available. By making multiple investments, countries were able to offset the risk of one vaccine failing with the hope that another would succeed.
It was like a race to have agreements with all pharmaceutical companies, all potential producers, because at the time they didn't know which vaccine will work.
This also meant that some countries bought enough doses to vaccinate their populations several times over. Canada, for example, has bought enough doses to vaccinate their population 5 times over. But poorer countries couldn't afford to take on such a risk, so they had to wait till vaccines had reached later stages of development before signing deals. But by then, they were stuck behind a very long line.
The little supply you have in the market is hoarded by rich countries. So the rest of the world was left struggling with the very little, with few millions of doses, not enough even to vaccinate at-risk groups.
These deals played a big role in speeding up the vaccine's development process, the fastest in human history. But they also largely shut out lower-income nations like Pakistan. As of May 2021, 87% of all vaccines globally had been administered to rich countries. Essentially, rich countries got more vaccines than they needed, and poor countries didn't get any. But bilateral deals aren't the only way countries gain early access to vaccines. Some countries have a home advantage, domestic manufacturing. A report published by the World Bank identified just 13 countries as the COVID-19 Vaccine Producers Club, and being a part of this club gave countries power. These countries used aggressive policies like export bans on vaccines and raw materials so that they could inoculate their residents first.
We just heard hours ago that India has placed a temporary hold on all exports of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine.
The European Union will take any action required to protect its citizens and rights.
The United States, first and foremost, is engaged in an ambitious and effective and so far successful effort to vaccinate the American people.
Policies like these that put domestic needs before global, equitable ones to secure more vaccines are what we call vaccine nationalism. And it's largely what's been fueling the vaccine access crisis. A crisis that has global implications. Studies have estimated vaccine nationalism could raise the global death rate by 26% and cost the global economy $9.2 trillion. It also risks the rise of the virus mutating into a variant that can evade vaccine protections. So what can we do to increase access? One program designed to solve this issue is COVAX. COVAX was an initiative started by the WHO in collaboration with 2 other global health organizations. Its goal is to ensure that 20% of the global population, specifically vulnerable health groups and healthcare workers, get the vaccine first, regardless of the country's wealth. 92 middle and lower income countries are dependent on COVAX for most of their vaccines, including Pakistan. COVAX functions by using 2 pools of investment. In the first pool, richer nations supply COVAX with funds, which it would use to make multiple investments for doses only high-income countries could access. That way, if a vaccine fails, the loss is shared and the risk of investment is lower. In the other pool, countries would donate money so that COVAX could purchase vaccines for low-income countries that would have otherwise struggled to gain access. COVAX hoped that by being the largest negotiator, it would have the power to negotiate lower drug prices and distribute vaccines equitably across the globe.
The idea of COVAX was really very, very good. It was supposed to really buy on behalf of everybody. And it's just, if you are a rich country, you pay for yourself. If you're a poor country, you get funded. Basically, you get the vaccine subsidized, heavily subsidized. That was the idea. And the vaccines will be allocated according to the WHO equitable access framework across the whole world, not in one country or the other.
And to its credit, COVAX has gotten vaccines to countries that would have otherwise gone without. But COVAX has problems. For starters, it only aims to vaccinate 20% of the population. And according to health experts, that's just not enough.
COVAX was never very ambitious in its vaccination goals. It was only aiming to vaccinate at best 20% of the populations of low and middle income countries. And that's clearly not going to get us anywhere close to herd immunity in much of the world. When you're talking about having to vaccinate 75 to 85% of population.
COVAX was also formed late, a month after the pandemic was declared, and by then many high-income nations had already begun forming bilateral deals. These countries also had no desire to be limited to COVAX's 20% goal. Still, if COVAX was to succeed, it would need donations from these countries. So it let them make bilateral deals and join the initiative, and that meant wealthier nations would still get to buy out supplies. COVAX also faced other difficulties. Funding has been slow, which has made it hard to buy vaccines. Even now, COVAX needs $2.6 billion to meet its goals. Export bans have also made vaccine distribution difficult. India's current export ban was a tough blow for the initiative, which was heavily dependent on the Serum Institute of India for its supply. This over-reliance has harmed countries dependent on COVAX, who no longer know when they will get their next doses.
But the challenge now is that we don't know when the next doses will come. So it's very possible that people will take their first shots and will not be able to determine when the second shots will come. So that is the challenge that a country like Ethiopia, the country of 100 million people, finds itself in, and many other African countries are in the same situation.
Moreover, relying on donations has its own problems and really is not a sufficient enough solution.
If you're reliant on vaccine donations, it means that you're going to have spurts of vaccine supply coming in and then periods with not enough vaccine supply, scarcity in the interim.
All of this means that despite its best efforts, COVAX is currently failing to meet its goals. So far, the initiative only accounts for 4% of the 2 billion shots administered globally, which is not nearly enough to meet their goal. And that means dependent countries will continue to have low vaccination rates. So what can we do to solve this crisis? India and South Africa are currently pushing for a TRIPS waiver, which Pakistan supports, for COVID-19 related vaccines and medications in the World Trade Organization. And this has the potential to solve the current inequality. In the next episode, we'll explore how the TRIPS waiver could be the solution Pakistan and other developing countries need. But until we actually do get more vaccines, countries need to remember to act cautiously.
I think India very much had that hubris of saying, oh, well, we got this figured out. We're somehow immune to this virus. this is not going to happen to us. And clearly that is not the case. And I think it's really only a matter of time before other countries like Pakistan, countries in Africa, for example, are hit also. And so I think what I would say is this is a cautionary tale, what is happening in India. Learn from the mistakes of others and prepare while you still can so that this doesn't happen to you.